Welcome to the lecture. We're talking today about social justice reimagined. That's what the lecture topic is. And what I want to talk about is a couple of different things, including self-compassion, self-care, community care, and I also want to bring in some ideas from Trisha Hersey. She talked a little bit about rest as resistance. And so we're going to include a couple of these really important topics in the lesson for today. So what is social justice reimagined? What does this mean? What does this look like? So I first want to start by introducing myself, and then we'll get into the topic. I am Rasha Mohamed, PhD. I currently work at AUS in Seattle, and I am a mom. I'm an educator. I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm a social justice advocate. I'm also a niece and a granddaughter and a daughter. And so you'll get to see some of those folks when we get into this. So social justice reimagined, what does this look like? So how I came to this topic was some of my experience with teaching students about social justice issues, how to include wellness in social justice, and really how to make this work sustainable. So I came across the NAP ministry, and Trisha person wrote a wonderful book on rest as resistance. And what this really brought to mind was, how do we include self-care and self-compassion as we're doing this really important liberation work? So liberation work, compassion, social justice work, these are all things that we'll talk about and I'll intertwine into this lecture. But what does it look like and what does it mean? So we talk about social justice work and advocacy work, and we also frame it in the things that it's not. So we frame it in things like it's anti-capitalist and it's anti-patriarchy and all of the isms, right? Ableism and sexism and homophobia, those kinds of things. And it's really important to distinguish what social justice work is by describing what it's countering. But I also want to talk about how to reframe this or reimagine it, really with the idea of making the work sustainable. So if we think about pushing against something, like we're pushing against capitalism or resisting oppression, that takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy from our physical bodies, our energy bodies. And what I want to say is, how do we reframe this in a way that's a little bit less pushing against and more inclusion? So I want to include things like rest. And with the NAP ministry, rest is resistance, really talks about how to rest more, do less, focus on producing less, focus on paying attention to our wellness, daydreaming. That's a really nice thing that's talked about in the NAP ministry. How do we daydream more? How is that a part of our rest? Napping, that's a big part of the rest is resistance. But you may say, I can't take a nap every day, or I have small children, or I'm a student, or I, teach many classes. I have many things to do. So taking a nap isn't something I can do. Well, in this particular work, what I want to suggest is rest can look a lot of different ways, specifically for those of us who are in academia, whether you're a faculty or whether you're a student or you're practicing, seeing clients. Rest can look so different for every person. So it can be not responding to an email immediately. It could be taking a break from social media. The NAP ministry talks about cleansing or taking big respites from social media quite a bit. We can also rest by just closing our eyes for a few minutes. Sometimes that's really helpful. And so this piece around how do we reimagine this work rather than pushing against things? How do we include more things? We want to focus the inclusion piece on these things that make us sustainable. So rest is important. Self-compassion is important. When we get into the lecture later, I want to talk a little bit more about feelings and going into depth about what feelings are like, how to identify feelings first, going inward first before reacting and responding to the environment around us, whether it's other people or whether it's something that we're being requested to do, an activity. or even responding to email, as I mentioned before, right? So we're talking about reimagining social justice in a way that looks more sustainable. And if we think about some of us who are faculty folks and we're working with students that are coming in that maybe are a different generation than us, they really have a really good grasp on how to take space and to do things that feel good to them. And I want to encourage all of us to do that. So that's also a piece of rest, focusing on things that do feel good. I want to include this piece about daydreaming. So when we were younger, we used to daydream a lot. And I don't know that anyone has done any research specifically on what it means to daydream. But what I want to include in this conversation is when we think about rest and self-compassion, specifically around social justice work, we really do have to go into our imagination, because if we only take a glimpse of what's happening around us, if we consume the news, if we consume social media feeds, it's just a regurgitation of things that are already happening. So we're not going to make a whole lot of movement if we're doing the things and watching the things and consuming with our eyes and our ears things that are already happening. So the rest piece and the self-compassion piece is really about taking a break from reality for just a little while, and then trying to find space in our hearts and in our minds where we can reimagine things in a way that feel good. So tapping into our emotions, paying attention to how we feel, taking a break from things that are being asked of us. And then also thinking about how capitalism plays into all of this. So thinking about capitalism and patriarchy, those things, and white supremacy culture as well. Those things have tenets around, like, the sense of urgency, for example. We see that in white supremacy culture, and we see it in capitalism as well. This sense of urgency, do things quickly, move quickly, talk quickly, respond to things quickly. So within the rest piece, if we want to not necessarily push against that, but pay attention to where the rest piece comes in, then we can think about, okay, well, if supremacy culture is pushing this, do things quickly and move fast, then maybe I can slow down a little bit and be a little bit more present before I take action. So I want to include that piece in our practice when we meet together. I want to include an activity that has to do with how to actually practice this on a personal level, with activities and things that you do on a daily basis. So back to what I was mentioning, rest, including that in self-compassion, including the social justice work that we're focused on, and the liberation work that we're focused on. So we've got grind culture, that's a part of supremacy culture. And then also we think about how does this look in terms of our work together as faculty, paying attention to how we engage with students, how we engage with curriculum. So for example, if we think about, as faculty folks, if we think about how do we include some of this work in our class, like how do we include this in our class lecture? Well, we know we have a finite amount of time, right? We have a semester piece or a quarter to cover material. So we want to also be mindful of how we can represent wellness within that space. So we can do things, and I'm sure many faculty folks already do this, where they include the students' feedback. You know, when would you like these assignments to be done? Or more practically speaking, when we have a group class or we're creating a group norm within the classroom, we have these discussions and we collaborate. So we co-create some of these rules and some of these norms with our students. And so I think about how do we grab some of these things and include them a little bit more across the whole program, within the classroom, within one semester, one quarter, working with students, but then more and more throughout the program. So we're talking about rest. We're talking about the ways in which we can include some of these tenets in the work that we do with students. And then I'm also wanting to mention, like, how do we do this as individuals, as people first, before we can try and demonstrate this for students or with students. So the piece that I want to get into when we meet together is the individual piece, identifying emotions individually, going inward first, reflecting first, trying to find a really nice space around what does this feeling feel like? How does it show up for me? And then where do I want to go with this feeling? Do I want to continue this same feeling and think about these same things and have this continued experience? Or if this is something that I want to find some relief around. So I want to practice, what does this look like to find relief? And then what does this look like in order to include this individually, as we then bring in that same practice within the engagement with students and with material. Okay, so let's think about an example. Within rest as resistance, there's a lot of mention around moving away from screens, going away from social media for a little while. She thinks she calls it like a social media cleanse. So what does this do, and how does this relate to rest? So we think about how much time we spend scrolling on social media or looking at computer screens, searching the internet, whether it's for work or other reasons. If we allow ourselves, 10 minutes out of the day to be away from the screen. Let's say we put our phones away for 10 minutes, or we step away from our computer for about 10 minutes. If we start there, what that does is it allows our eyes to kind of recenter, readjust to being in the room, looking at natural light, and not looking at the lights that come from computer screens. And for my own practice, what that means for my body is that my sensory systems are not intaking so much information. So I get to slow down a little bit, even for 10 minutes. So if we get to practice this as individuals on an individual basis and then reap the benefits of what this feels like, what does it feel like in our bodies? What does it feel like for our minds and our eyes to not look at a computer screen just for 10 minutes? And then imagine what that would be like if we increase that time over some weeks. So maybe we work up to 2 hours a day where we're not looking at computer screens. Imagine what we could do with those 2 hours. Would we go for a walk? Would we spend more time in nature? How does that recenter our brains and our bodies? We could also think about spending that time daydreaming. We could spend that time imagining things that haven't happened yet. And so we think about what happens when we continue on in the same way that we are. Then that leads us into grind culture, which is this false thinking of, if I do more, I'm going to accomplish more, and somehow that adds to my overall value. And I'm proposing that we rest more, do less, and we're still just as worthy, whether we spend 10 hours a day working or more, versus spending less than that. So we're talking about taking a rest from computer screens, including more activities in our day, spending time in nature, spending time daydreaming, and then feeling the biological, physiological, and psychological benefits of just giving ourselves that respite from the computer screen, from work, from social media. So when I practice this as an individual, then I'm able to include this in some of the work that I do with my students. And I can also, as a supervisor, encourage students to do this work with their clients. This idea of slowing down, this idea of taking rest as resistance. Resistance against what? Resistance against productivity, against capitalism. So including more of this kind of work is really what is at the crux of this particular lesson. So resting from computer screens is an example. Daydreaming is another example, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. But then also kind of giving ourselves a break, physically, not being inside all day, being outside more. And then even thinking about including more like hobbies and activities. And again, someone may say, that's not something I can do because I have to work 60 hours a week, which is some people's day-to-day lives, right? And so I want to just encourage folks to think about, okay, well, maybe I can't take a 10-minute walk outside, or maybe it's not sustainable for me to do that, but I can, again, take a break from the computer. I can look out the window. I can spend some time gazing outside, looking at trees, looking at what's happening outside my window, and do that with intention. So not doing it with the sort of like just passing, right? I get bored, because we all do that. We all spend some time at work and you find yourself staring out the window, or you find yourself scrolling. It's sort of this, your body wants to sort of numb from the overwork or the overburden of taking in all this information. And so we kind of do it without being deliberate, but I'm wanting to encourage us to be more intentional. So giving ourselves, maybe every hour, giving ourselves a break, even if it's a 5-minute break. Away from computer screens is a really good one. Spending time outside is a really good one. And what I've included in my own practice is daydreaming out loud in community. So I have a couple of really great friends, some of them who also are at Antioch. And we daydream out loud together. And so we'll cut out time maybe once a week or once every other week where we don't talk about work, we don't talk about things that cause us to be productive, but we say things like, wouldn't it be great if we could vacation somewhere warm and tropical? And what has happened, what has been the result of some of that daydreaming out loud with others, this kind of community care, if you will, is that some really important passion projects have come out of that. So what I want to think about and encourage us to do is, even if it's just small little steps, example, moving away from your computer for 10 minutes, not looking at a screen for just 10 minutes a day, and then over time increasing that. Taking your physical body out of one space and moving it to another. Maybe going outside for a walk isn't reasonable, but you can move from room to room. And then take some time to sort of reflect on what that feels like to be in a different room. And if we do this intentionally, not just on happenstance, but we do it intentionally, we begin to feel the benefit of that. We feel the benefit in our bodies. We tend to relax a little bit more. When we're relaxed and a little less focused on getting work done, it leaves room for creation. It leaves room for recreating and developing things that we just haven't done yet. And this idea of grind culture is sort of a myth, right? Where we think about, if I just work harder and put in more time, if I just add some more, another couple of hours to my work week, I'll be more productive. When in reality, that little bit of productivity causes us to be more stressed and less rested and less effective. And so if we take time to rest and recover and rebound, we're much more able to create, and we're much more able to kind of tap into our internal empowerment. So that's what I want to encourage us to do. For those of us who are in a teaching position, when we're able to do that, when we're able to grade our assignments for students from this rested place, then it's going to feel so different than when I got to hurry up and get this done because it's due by X amount of, X date. Even if that rest looks like a few minutes, even if there's a pause in between certain things, it allows for us to recenter. It allows for us to come back to neutrality before taking the next step, before doing the next activity. So that's a challenge I want to offer for us to do, even as a collective. How do we do that, even in our staff meetings? How do we dream out loud together? How do we not talk against the things that we don't want to see, but we deliberately focus on the things that we do want to see. And really that comes from, I want to encourage our leaders within groups to bring that topic into space together. Because I think that's really where it's helpful. We all recognize that being a part of higher ed is a part of the capitalistic patriarchal space. That is the work that we're involved in, the container that we're in. But we can, as deliberate people, we can decorate that container in a way that feels good to us. And I've said many times in other talking spaces that because I'm a woman of color, I recognize that the institution that I'm in is not built for me. So I need to care for myself in a space that isn't made for me in order for me to be well. And that's what I want to encourage us to do. How do we take the social justice work 2.0, reimagine, and design it in a way that feels good to our bodies? And when we're in a place where our bodies feel better and we are more centered, then we're able to teach from a place of centeredness, and we're able to supervise students from a place of centeredness rather than a place of pushing against or trying not to uphold these ideas of oppression and supremacy.